Hey everyone, and welcome to the tutorial for one of our birdhouse or sandwich board inserts. So this one is going to be used for summer. It's got some fun suns and a couple beach balls. In the example that I have just shown you, I do use a color called Dixie Belle Blue, but for this video I had run out of Dixie Belle Blue, so I'm improvising with a different color called the Gulf. The rest of the colors are going to be the same though. So first off, I'm going to take some of my painter's tape. I'm rolling each of the ends, sticking the ends down to the table so that I have a piece of tape that is sticky side up. A couple things you're going to need is going to be some paint pens, some scissors, paint palette if you have it. If not, a paper plate is fine, some sponges, and then you can also use brushes if you don't have sponges. And then you're going to want some glue. I use Gorilla Super Glue for my stuff, but wood glue works perfectly fine as well if you have the patience for it. So to get started, you're going to grab your colors, which are Colonel Mustard and Daisy, Flamingo, and there's the Gulf that I switched up for the Dixie Belle Blue. Once you have all of your things laid out, you can go ahead and start separating your pieces. Just remember, whichever side is up is the side that's going to be up. If they get flipped around, then they might not fit when it comes time for assembly. If that does happen, not a big deal, just means you're going to have to paint the other side again. So here I'm separating my pieces out into colors, keeping the same colors together so it's easier when it comes time for painting to remember which is which. This one doesn't have very many pieces, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started on my first color. And I am using a used sponge, so I'm just going to snip off the end, get a nice new end to it. I'm going to use that just to sponge this color onto all of my current pieces. Here you can use a brush if you'd like. I just didn't feel like dirtying up any brushes, so I just went ahead with sponges for it instead. When it comes to coverage, this is all personal preference. A lot of times I am perfectly content with just one coat. Sometimes on a big open area like that, I like to just dab on a little bit extra to make sure I have all of the wood covered. You can go ahead and just do a full second coat on everything if you wish as well. It's going to come down to personal preference. Once I finish with that color, I'm going to go ahead and remove these pieces from my tape very carefully because they might still be quite damp. And then I'm going to go ahead and replace the next pieces onto my piece of tape. Once you have your pieces sorted, I went ahead and I poured a little bit of the Flamingo into my paint palette. If you have the little paint pots that come with your kits, if you purchase the subscription box, the easiest thing actually, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning of the video, is to kind of scoop that paint out onto a paint palette or a paper plate. You can use it directly from the paint pots if you have brushes, but getting the sponges in there is kind of difficult. So I find it's easier to scoop it out first. Just adding a little bit of Flamingo to my pieces, dabbing straight up and down with the thick end of my sponge, getting a nice even coverage. Now that I'm finished with the Flamingo color, I'm going to go ahead and move on to my yellow. I'm going to start with the Daisy yellow, which is the bright yellow, and do all of my yellow pieces with that first. Once I finish with those little pieces of the door, if you have the sandwich board, you don't have this, I'm going to go ahead and move on to my main pieces. So for the main pieces, you don't have to worry about where the ball pieces go. Those will get covered with the additional pieces that you've already painted. So you're just going to want to make sure you have enough yellow to cover anything that might be showing once you add the ball pieces onto it. I always tend to use a little bit more paint than I need to, just to make sure everything is covered. So that when it comes time for assembly, you don't have to do as many touch-ups. Just going straight up and down with my sponge, sponging on the bright yellow color. When it comes to doing the main back piece, you're only going to do that center sun. And also where there is a line for the center of the sun, don't really have to worry about getting too much paint in there because that's going to end up getting covered once you assemble everything. Once I've finished with all of my bright yellow, I'm going to go on to the darker mustard yellow. And this is just going to add a little bit of accenting to your pieces. Gives it a little bit of a shadow. So I'm going to take the same sponge. This already has the daisy yellow, the bright yellow on it, and I'm just going to put the front half of my sponge into the mustard yellow, leaving the daisy yellow on the back half of the sponge. And I'm going to sponge off some of it to give a nice blend look. So it's going to be kind of difficult to see in the lighting of this video, but I am just adding a little bit of the mustard yellow to the edge of that circle. And I'm going to do that to all of them, and I'm going to do it to the sun as well, and I'm only going to really do it on one edge. You just want to give some shadowing to one side. Because those colors are so close to each other, it's just going to give us very, very subtle shading to it. If you wanted something a little bit deeper, you could always blend a little bit of the flamingo orange into it. And you can always add a little bit of flamingo to your yellow if you want to tone it down and create your own color. If you wanted something that was a little bit more of a contrast and not quite so subtle. To give you an example of the flamingo, here I am. I'm just going to dip just a tiny, tiny bit of flamingo. And I'm kind of blending the yellow and the flamingo together. And I'm just going to add it to a couple of my door pieces to give you an idea of how different of a contrast that is. So you can already see right there it's a little bit more pronounced than the mustard yellow was. While I still have some yellow on my sponge, I'm going to go ahead and use it for accenting of my other pieces. For these particular pieces, I was just making sure I was accenting the tops of them. And I'm just doing a little tiny bit on the top just to give it a little bit of a coloration difference. So here I am, I'm lining up my pieces to make sure I have the top versus the bottom. They do fit one way and one way only, so just be aware of that when you're doing any of your accenting, that make sure you have your pieces in the correct direction. Once I finished with all of my painting, I'm going to make sure everything is dry. And then if you have a fine white paint pen, that's what I'm going to use to do my accent lines. So here I'm lining everything up just so I can make sure I'm putting my accent lines in the correct spot. I'm kind of keeping that dark yellow on the same side of the sun. And right here, it's going to be on the top of the sun and then on the top of the center of the sun. So I'm just making sure that they're positioned correctly so I can get my accent lines in the right spots. Just adding a couple lines, a couple dots. You can do as much or as little of this as you'd like. This comes down to personal preference and just kind of playing with it to see what you like. Once you have all of your accent lines done, it is time for assembly. I do highly recommend to dry fit everything together to make sure you have everything going in the correct spots. Some pieces have a home and one home only, so you just want to make sure before you glue anything down that you have them in the right spots. So I'm just going to add a couple dabs of my super glue around my pieces. Try not to glue my fingers to my pieces this time. It is likely to happen, but I try my best every time not to. Because I use super glue, everything dries very, very quickly, so my project is now completely done. If you had wood glue, it would take a little bit longer to cure. Thanks for joining me for another video, and be sure to subscribe for more.